On today's show, what NBA analysts and mock drafts are saying the Houston Rockets should do with the number 3 overall pick. What head coach Ime Udoka believes this team is missing and needs to add either with the pick or by trading it. Draft combine news and notes on Reed Sheppard, Donovan Clingan, Stephon Castle, and so much more. It's all coming up on today's Locked On Rockets.
This is Mission Control, Houston.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. As always, I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, native Houstonian and credentialed media member. I'm also the host of Locked On NBA Mondays. Be sure to follow along wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe where I want your thoughts. Because we don't know what's going to happen with this pick. Give me your thoughts. What do you want to see the Rockets do with this pick? What prospects are you most interested by? What stands out to you about what you've seen from the NBA Draft Combine so far? Let me know in the YouTube comments. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more with FanDuel. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 with any winning $5 bet. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And as always, thank you so much for making Locked On Rockets part of your day every single day, whether it's on your way to work, on your lunch break, in the gym. Thank you for being an everydayer. Joining us now is your weekly co-host, the podfather himself, Rockets Wire editor and host of the Logger Line podcast, Ben DuBose. You can track down on the Twitter streets at Ben DuBose. Here as we are breaking down and discussing all of the NBA draft news and notes and excitement surrounding these prospects and what the Houston Rockets may or may not do with this 3rd overall pick. Ben, just give me your immediate reaction to this, to the Rockets jumping from 9 to 3, in this year's draft.
Overjoyed, because if they had stayed at 9 or 10 in a relatively weak draft, I think the odds were it wouldn't be an asset, no matter the end result, that we'd be that excited about. If it was traded for a future pick, it wouldn't be a particularly good one. If it was traded as part of a package for a win now upgrade, it probably would not be the primary part of the package because of its low value. And if they just pick someone at 9 or 10, then ultimately having to go deep on your draft board in a draft that's weaker at the start would probably not result in a player that the fan base would be all that excited about, at least not initially. As opposed to now, I mean, there's so many options. If you just keep the pick, then going at number 3 overall, you can get a guy that's close to the top of your draft board. And while there's no Wemby or Paolo Banchero in this draft, look, the Rockets have had a lot of success the last few years drafting in the middle of the first round. Alperen Sengun at 16, Tari Eason at 17, Cam Whitmore at 20. Are you really going to tell me that this draft doesn't have someone at the top that isn't comparable to guys that went in the middle to late first round the last couple of years? I don't buy that for a second. There are guys that are capable in this draft. They're just a little bit tougher to find than they usually are at the very top. That's where you have to trust your draft gurus to do their jobs, and the Rockets have generally done well at that. So by being able to pick at the front of the line or very close to the front of the line, they might just stay there and get a player we're actually excited about, as opposed to having to go, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th on the draft board, whatever it may be, had they not moved up. And then as far as trade opportunities, look, pick 3 is a lot more attractive on the market than pick 9. It can be a much larger part of a package if there is a win now veteran, if there is a star available. And then if you do the least sexy move, which is trade it for future picks, well, by being at number 3 overall, I'm guessing you can get at least 2 future picks, either trade back in a future pick or just 2 future picks in upcoming years, simply based on being this high in the order. So no matter the end outcome, you're going to get a good asset out of this, be it now or in the future, in a way that you would not have if it was at 9 or 10.
The only downside to your argument about, the mid-tier picks in recent drafts, and being able to get a talent, at least on the same level, ideally, is I've seen some draft heads basically saying stuff like, if Cam Whitmore was in this year's draft, he'd go number 1 overall in a heartbeat. So it's like, as far as
but you're at 3. That's my point, though.
That's fair.
You're pretty damn close.
There should be some talent there. And so far, credit to you, Ben. You did a kind of a roundup of all the mocks over at Rockets Wire, what some of the, NBA draft analysts are kind of saying right now. And the actual leading contender right now for the Houston Rockets across what I've got collected, you tallied 8 different mock drafts, and then I added my own because the Athletics' Kelly Eco put out a mock draft via The Athletic. So the leading contender right now for the Rockets is actually Donovan Clingan, with 4 different websites, analysts, whatever, picking him to go to the Rockets number 3 overall. So far, Tankathon, Sam Vecini with The Athletic, Kristen Peak from Yahoo Sports, and then NBA Draft Room all have Donovan Clingan going to the Houston Rockets number 3 overall. And I'm torn on it because I'm really excited by Donovan Clingan, but there's been some discussion, on social media and whatnot about, okay, can he and Alperen Sengun coexist? And I think that's almost maybe a little bit premature in this discussion, right? Rafael Stone made it readily apparent that he is prioritizing the best talent, the best, player available with that 3rd overall pick. And when you look at what the Rockets have, across their roster right now, just throw all that out the window, right? If you think Donovan Clingan is the best possible player that you can get at pick number 3, then that's the guy that you should ultimately take.
Right. And we're entering a point in the Rockets rebuild where I do think there's going to be more volatility with the roster moving forward than there has been the last couple of years. In the phase 1 of the rebuild, it was all about just asset accumulation. And when you're not trying to win, there's nothing more valuable than young guys on cheap rookie contracts with upside. So unless you're just overwhelmed with a trade offer, then you just let those guys play, see what they turn into, and hopefully you get lucky. Now that you're going into phase 2 and eventually phase 3, where contracts get more expensive and the team is trying to win eventually at a championship level, there is going to be some harder decisions, some strategic moves, some business of basketball moves that are a little more complicated than just run your young guys out there and hope for the best.
Business and basketball moves. Do you mean the Rockets should use the number 3 pick on Bronny James so that the Vipers can have filled
to sell out the Vipers
merchandise?
Yeah.
that was one of the most ridiculous takes that I've ever seen. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. But I would just say that in general, and this also goes back to, the expectations for rookies changing. This is not like when you drafted Jalen or Jabari at pick 2 or pick 3 and you were going to throw them into 30 minutes per game roles immediately. No, it's plausible that if you keep the pick this year, whoever you draft might go to the G League, and that's okay. And so it's probably not going to be until at least year 2, probably year 3, by the time whoever you draft is ready to play anything close to starters level minutes in the NBA. So in terms of Donovan Clingan, the question of how exactly does he fit with Alperen Sengun, you're probably not going to need an answer to that question until 2026 at the latest, at the earliest, if you draft Clingan. So I'm not going too far down the road now. There's so many things that can change. Your roster might change. Perhaps Clingan or Sengun or both develops a 3-point shot. There are so many possibilities between now and then that I don't think it's worth putting that too high on your priority list. Because worst case, even if Clingan plays very well in a 20 minutes per game role as a backup, maybe by the end of year 1, all in year 2. But Sengun is a superstar. He gets the max deal. Everything looks great there. He's your franchise player. Even if all that happens just as you expect and there's no roster upheaval, there's no injuries. Well, if Clingan plays well in those 20 minutes per game and he's blocked and they can't play together and it just feels like you're stuck, okay, then if he's as good as you think he is, and he develops, then he's going to be a really good trade asset. And you would rather have a really good player who's a good trade asset than a worse player who's a better short-term fit. So the bottom line is, I'm not saying that fit is not a part of the priority matrix at all. What I'm saying is that it shouldn't be a factor in and of itself. It should be one of many. And so if you think Donovan Clingan is the best player available, then especially when you look at the timeline, the fact it's going to take into year 2, year 3, then I think you take the best player and you worry about the rest later. I don't know that Donovan Clingan is that guy, but if he is, you should be open to that path.
You mentioned this elsewhere too. I think fit is best used as a tiebreaker, right? Like if you've got 2 prospects that are very close across the board and you're really torn between them, then absolutely, right? You could factor in, okay, well, maybe Donovan Clingan makes more sense as like a direct backup 5 to Sengun this next season, or somebody that can learn under the tutelage of Steven Adams, right? A guy that you can slow play the development of. Maybe that fit makes more sense than drafting Rob Dillingham, right? Yet another kind of bucket getting, 2 guard, right, when you already have a Jalen Green, you already have a Cam Whitmore on the roster already. You don't want that many duplicative skill sets across the board. So I do think that is a really great way to kind of factor fit into things after you've already kind of assessed your big board, who the best player available is, all that good stuff. I do want to get to some of the other kind of mock drafts, what some of the other analysts have the Rockets doing with that 3rd overall pick, as well as we're going to get to some thoughts from Ime Udoka and what he's kind of envisioning for what the Houston Rockets need, what this roster needs, as well as some just miscellaneous news and notes coming out of the draft combine over these first couple days. We're going to get there in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own, because right now new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. And all you have to do is wager $5 right now. You can head over to FanDuel.com and take a look at the odds for the number one overall pick in this year's NBA draft. Alex Sarr, currently the favorite to go number one overall at minus 190. Zachary Risochet right behind him at plus 290. And Donovan Clingan, a distant third place favorite at plus 1,300. So for all those odds and so much more, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count. FanDuel, America's number one sportsbook. And continuing on here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. We should temporarily change the name to Locked On NBA Draft Content, Ben, because that's basically what we're doing for the next 6 weeks here, especially with the jump from 9 to 3. Now there's all this extra excitement around the draft. Couple of the other mocks that we have for the Rockets and what they're going to do with pick 3. We had a couple people picking Reed Sheppard, Jonathan Givony from ESPN, Brian Kalborowski from For the Win, both selecting Reed Sheppard. We have one pick for Rob Dillingham from Ricky O'Donnell, SB Nation, and then one for Zachary Risochet is how you say it last week. It's like
that's it. Yeah,
super French, but we'll just call him Zach. That's the super easy way. Zach, we had one pick for him, James Fletcher, and then Kelly Iko of The Athletic, who people should be familiar with if you're listening or watching the show, Houston Rockets beat writer. He picked Matas Buzelis, which not a completely like off the wall pick, but
by the way, we should also note that Jonathan Fagan of the Chronicle, longtime beat writer, he picked Zach as well. So there's 2 for him. Fagan's mock just came out after I published my article. Okay, there we go. Good point. Okay, sweet. So a couple picks for Zach there. Now, what's crazy to me, Ben, is we've seen, I think that the crazy thing about this draft cycle is there isn't a clear-cut guy, right? There's no tier, there's no like drop off. It's not like the year where it was, Jabari, Chet, and Paolo, where it's like clearly like the big 3 at the top of the draft, and then a distinct drop off into the tier 2 of prospects. This year, it could be, I think the only prospect that is maybe that far and above the other guys is maybe Alex Sarr, just because the way the NBA is trending, his skill set, his measurables, all that. He seems like a guy that's probably going to be a number 1 or number 2 overall pick. I see him mocked pretty consistently as the number 1 guy to the Atlanta Hawks. But even this, like I've seen some people say Reed Sheppard is a reach, or you can't take Reed Sheppard 3rd overall. And I don't see why you couldn't. He's going to be a good player in the NBA. Yeah, and I will say with the Hawks and Wizards being the teams in front of you, I tend to think that if they stay where they are and they don't trade those picks, then I think based on their situations, they might take the higher upside swings. And I think generally the international guys appear to have a bit more volatility, i.e. there's a little more risk, but there's also, a greater payoff. There's an easier route to see one of those international guys becoming a true superstar as opposed to a Reed Sheppard or a Donovan Clingan. But if you're in Houston's spot and you already have a core 6 and you already have so much upside as is, then I think the Rockets are a little more okay with taking someone that, might have a slightly lower ceiling if there's a very good likelihood of them achieving the floor. If you noticed when Rafael Stone answered your question, he initially said star player, and then he added a caveat. He said successful. And I think that's one where I don't know if Reed Sheppard can be a star player, but he can be a successful one. And I thought that Rafael adding that as something of a qualifier was noteworthy given their situation, because unlike other teams, the Wizards are in a rebuild already. And I tend to think the Hawks will go down that path because there's been rumors about Trey and Murray for a while being on the trade market. They seem to be sort of spinning their wheels, and it's an opportunity for them to sort of reset. Then I tend to think they might take some higher upside swings, which seems to be the international guys. And so that might leave the college trio, Sheppard, Clingan, maybe Rob Dillingham, available to the Rockets. And I think the Rockets, where they are, it's not that ceiling doesn't matter, but I don't think they have to weigh ceiling quite as heavily as those other teams. The Rockets can be a bit more selective based on the strength of the young core that's already in place.
I like that. No, that's a really great. I think that's probably the right approach for the Rockets to take if they're keeping this pick. And that it's kind of weird because that argument almost seems like you're going, oh, well, you're then arguing fit over best player available. You want to take the best player. You want the biggest swing possible. Well, no, because if you take that big swing and then that player doesn't pan out, if you can get a high floor player, somebody who projects to be a 8 to 10 year kind of NBA player, quality rotation player, gives you solid minutes, maybe slightly above average, replacement level starter, that kind of outcome, I think you can easily see how Reed Sheppard's skill set would translate to the NBA and how he could, conceivably be a long-term, at some point NBA level starter with the shooting, with the defense, all of that.
And if it's at all close between Sheppard and Clingan or Sheppard and someone else, then the fact that Sheppard is so plug and play and the fact that he fits in so many different roster constructs can be a tiebreaker of sorts. I don't think it should be the singular factor that you consider, but if it's close in regards to his overall package versus someone else, and he's so easily moldable in a number of roster constructs, then that could be the tiebreaker that puts him over the top. And I would just say that for the Rockets, I pointed out the business of basketball argument earlier in the pod as far as the Rockets transitioning to phase 2, phase 3, and your young guys, Jalen and LP, eligible for extensions this offseason, and then Jabari and Tari a year later, and Cam a year after that. So this team is going to get much more expensive. We know that's coming. And so being able to draft, let's say, a high-end role player on a rookie scale deal at sub-MLE money, that is potentially really, really useful to this team. And that's why the more I think about it, the more open I am to just keeping this pick. My initial inclination when they jumped on Sunday afternoon was to try and trade it for veteran help because the Rockets already have a young core and they want to win big as soon as possible. We know they are ready to take that next step under Ime Udoka. Well, most of the big names that are available on the trade market this summer, let's use Brandon Ingram as a hypothetical because that's been thrown out that the Pelicans want to move out to the top of the 2024 draft. Well, no, just stay with me. Even if you like Brandon Ingram, he's a free agent in 2025. So it's not just about Brandon Ingram, the basketball player. It's also about, okay, does he want to be in Houston? If not, that's a pretty big gamble for a guy that could leave in a year. And then even if he wants to be in Houston, okay, are you in alignment on his role? Are you in alignment on what his next contract is going to look like? Do you believe in him so much that he's going to be a positive value no matter what? Or could this be a Bradley Beal situation where once the guy is given something at the max or close to it, and he's in his late 20s, then the value declines to something close to neutral because he's no longer a value. And then all of a sudden you're giving up way more this summer than you would get in a future trade if for some reason the fit isn't there. There's just a lot of questions. And Ingram's one example. You can say the same thing, though, with Lauri Markkanen, Donovan Mitchell, guys that are a little higher end. Most of the names conceivably on the market are 2025 free agents. That's very just by default uncertain. And if you get a guy with 4 years of club controlled below market labor, that is very, very valuable for a team that's going to be more expensive. As opposed to the trade route, most of the guys on the market are going to be guys on short-term contracts, so you're probably going to have to give them a raise. There's a lot more uncertainty. Not saying that it can't all line up. It can. There's just a lot more questions. There's a lot more nuance to it than I think we initially thought Sunday afternoon when the Rockets get this high pick, and it's like, we can move this for, big name star, whoever's in the market in the next month. You might can, but there's a lot of things that really need to line up.
And I think it's a fantastic point to bring up that, the monetary incentive of keeping this pick and being able to have somebody under club control for 4 years on sub MLE money, right? That is a first round draft pick. Having control on that player for 4 years is the best monetary value you get for a player, as long as that player actually, pans out, becomes a rotation player, starter, whatever. That's the best money you get on an NBA contract, aside from, a true blue superstar talent like Nikola Jokic or Giannis Antetokounmpo on like an actual max deal, because obviously those players are worth even more than the max contract that they have. But the NBA stipulates you can only pay a player X amount of money, so they're capped out where they are. But when we're looking at what this Rockets team ultimately needs to improve on, there's a lot of areas, right, that we can look at this past season and point to, shooting being one of the number one areas that they need a lot of improvement in. Kelly Eco mentioned him earlier in the pod. He's actually in Chicago at the draft combine. He had a chance to talk to Ime Udoka, and Udoka said this about what they're kind of looking for as far as areas of improvement when it comes to the roster. Udoka said, we're trying to have internal growth with our guys we have first and foremost, but shooting is always at a premium. So you look at that, versatility across the board with how we defend and want to play, and well-rounded players. We want shot creation as well, trying to cover all the bases. And with that third pick, you can do that with a lot of these players. So while I will say we're discussing this third pick and whether the Rockets keep it, trade it, all this stuff, there's been a lot of things, some reporting to suggest that the Rockets are going to be incredibly aggressive in trying to trade that pick, probably for a win now player. We had Adrian Wojnarowski at the draft lottery discussing that the Rockets were going to be very aggressive in pushing that pick. We know that there was reporting that Rafael Stone was even, visiting the idea of swapping the remaining Brooklyn Nets assets with Brooklyn for the future of the Suns assets they currently own by way of the Kevin Durant trade. So we know that these picks, the Brooklyn picks, which obviously this one just turned into the number 3 overall pick, have been shopped around previously. So I don't know if it's easier for the Rockets to, I guess, address those team needs, right? The shooting, the shot creation, the versatility. If it's easier for them to address that with maybe a high floor rookie with the 3rd overall pick, or at the end of the day, dealing that for a win now veteran who maybe checks more of those boxes.
There's another part of this equation, though, that needs to be considered, and that's the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which offers a starting salary at nearly $15 million per year these days. That's a pretty sizable chunk of change, and you can get a quality player this summer. So you already have a 9-man rotation as is, and you have the ability to add a quality 10th player if you choose to do so. So that has to be a part of this thinking as well. Why would you use the number 3 pick to add a player if it's comparable to what you could get with a non-taxpayer mid-level exception, and then you keep your number 3 and you add that on top of it? That's what you've got to consider. And so I keep going back to the fact that there's a very high bar. If the player checks all the boxes financially in terms of his basketball impact and so on and so forth, then yeah, I could see it being worthwhile. But it's harder than you might think, because if it's a little lower in terms of the basketball value, then why wouldn't you just use your MLE and get someone of comparable value without using your draft capital, and use your draft capital on someone that has more long-term upside because of his age, because of the club control in terms of the amount of years, and so on and so forth. So that just makes it a little more challenging in that, yes, I see the case for adding, a 10th win now player, another veteran to your team that can help out in some of these areas. But if you can do it with the MLE, then yeah, you can make a little bit more of a long-term upside bet with the pick. And that's what, honestly, the best teams do. The best teams have a continual pipeline, so that if you do lose some of your veterans because of the business of basketball, because your team gets more expensive, because there are some team building penalties under the new CBA as teams get more expensive, then you have younger guys internally that you're constantly developing to step into larger roles. And I think that's what this pick is an opportunity to do. And, Ime mentioned, shooting and shot creation, and that points to, Reed Sheppard and perhaps to a lesser extent, Rob Dillingham. I would agree with the way most people read that. But I also think that the emphasis on versatile defending, I think back to what Ime said when a year ago he was introduced in Houston at his initial press conference. He talked about getting different types of bigs alongside Alperen and Sengun. We know at the time he was alluding to a pursuit of Brook Lopez. It didn't work out. There are a lot of similarities, at least defensively, between Donovan Clingan and Brook Lopez. Now, Clingan still needs to develop the three-point shot to be a true 5-out the way Lopez was and still is to an extent, but Clingan seems to be confident in that. I'm sure the Rockets will do their due diligence in this process. And so if he checks those boxes, then I think he potentially fits that criteria as well, because when Ime talks about defending differently, that's not just in terms of perimeter defense, that's also potentially interior defense. We know they tried to address it last offseason. Potentially they could in the draft as well. Don't think it will be the only criteria they consider, but it will be a part of the package.
That's why I'm firmly in the camp, because I've had these discussions before, and I even, when I was kind of floating the idea of, would Eric Gordon be open to a return to Houston, right? If obviously things ended very poorly in Phoenix, and that situation over there is, close to untenable. The issue here, even though, yes, the Rockets have the MLE, they could throw that at a player. Sometimes the money is not just enough. Sometimes a player wants a clear role on a team. And I think it's a lot harder to sign a player outright with the MLE and say, hey, we don't necessarily have like a clear cut, like you're going to get a guaranteed 20, 25, 30 a night or whatever. And then who do you ultimately take those minutes away from? I think that becomes maybe a little bit harder. And it's easier, like you said, if you keep the pick and you have a team, a team controlled player for 4 years, somebody that you can develop, that you can, stick behind the scenes and say, hey, we're not giving you minutes right away, right? We're focused on your development. Right. Very similar to what they did with Cam Whitmore, right? Rafael Stone mentioned that in his post-lottery press conference when he talked about the fact that they're not worried about not having minutes to develop somebody or not being able to throw them into the mix the way that Jalen and Sengun were their rookie seasons. They can slow play it, grow somebody behind the scenes a little bit, and make sure that player is ready to go when the time comes, when it's time to call their number. But we have a few more. We just got some news and notes just from the NBA Draft Combine that we want to tackle some things about. Reed Sheppard, Donovan Clingan, Stephon Castle, and a few other names that we're going to get to here in just one moment. First, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with more than 3 million members. It's the easiest and most exciting way to get in on the action while you watch your favorite sports and players. You just pick more or less on 2 or more players' stats and watch the winnings roll in. Prize Picks really is so simple to play. You can make your picks and submit an entry in less than 60 seconds. Quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, and an enormous selection of different players and stat types are what makes Prize Picks the #1 DFS app on the market. And right now, it's not too late. You can still get in on the playoff action and win up to 100 times your money with Prize Picks as you and the world's best players take the game to a new level during the NBA postseason. So if you've been thinking about trying out daily fantasy sports, give Prize Picks a chance. Download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, go grab the app and use code LOCKEDONNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy. And final segment here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast, home for everything Houston Rockets basketball. Ben, at the end of that last segment, you mentioned Donovan Clingan's confidence at, building up and working on that three-point shot. That really seems to be kind of a selling point for him at the draft combine. He's really trying to gas himself up as a shooter, and I don't think that's necessarily something that is going to maybe translate right away, but it's definitely a skill set where you see everything that he's capable of right now, the way that he is a defense, altering type player, right? Very much in line with a Rudy Gobert type or a Brook Lopez type, where you kind of fundamentally change your defensive scheme to accommodate him and to play to his strengths, right? Funneling guys into the interior, right? Really clogging up the paint, protecting the rim, all that. If you can project down the line, even if it's 4 or 5 years down the line, that a defensive presence like that can also add a substantial three-point shot to his game, even just to the point where he keeps defenses honest and he's a respectable three-point shooter. Doesn't have to be a knockdown guy, doesn't have to be 40%. That becomes a really enticing piece, right? That's exactly what the Rockets were pursuing when they tried to go after Brook Lopez in the first place this past offseason.
And we should note that Alperen Sengun is just 21 years old, and he's constantly working on his jump shot as well. To stick with the Lopez analogy, so Brook was drafted in 2008. It was not until the 2016 to 2017 season, at the end of 2016, 8 years into the league, until he started shooting threes. So you don't have to have all the answers immediately. And I think that's what's sort of misguided about some of the draft analysis that I've seen. You don't have to know day one how these guys are going to fit together, because spoiler alert, even if you do draft Donovan Clingan, Alperen Sengun is going to be way better than him on day one. And if you keep Steven Adams, he's probably going to be better as well. So Clingan may play in the G League, and perhaps by the end of year one, he's pushing Steven Adams for some backup minutes, assuming you keep Steven and you don't use him as salary filler, which would be an option. By the time Clingan would be good enough to justify enough minutes in terms of, 25 or more, to where there might be a little bit of a conflict between Clingan and Sengun, we're going to be so far down the line in all likelihood that there's just going to be there's going to be so many potential variables that could change over that time, not just in terms of the roster, but just the players themselves. And the three-point shot is a good example. Somebody can develop that type of skill that completely transforms their ability as a player and the lineups that they can be put on the court with. It's just, there's so much unknown. And Cam Whitmore is a good example. If we were talking last July or August and trying to project Cam Whitmore as a rookie, we would have never seen a scenario where he got the playing time than he did, that he ended up better than Reggie Bullock, who was a starting level player the previous season. Now, the Rockets did not have Bullock yet, but stick with me as far as the hurdles that Cam had to overcome. We also would not have guessed that he'd be playing over Kevin Porter Jr., but Kevin Porter Jr. lost his mind and basically got himself kicked out of the NBA. This stuff happens, and that's just in the span of a few months. If we're talking about years, which is typically the development curve, when we talk about taking a rookie and taking him into being worthy of 30 minutes, and I think this is where Rockets fans get lost. Yeah, Jalen and Jabari played 30 minutes per game as rookies. It's not because they deserved it. It's because the Rockets were basically tanking and there were no stakes. So they said, what the hell? Let's just see what happens. No, if we're talking about putting a new rookie into a situation where he's actually playing minutes and earning minutes on a team trying to win, it's probably going to take 2-3 years. And by that point, there's so many things that can change, both in terms of the roster, the players themselves. I just don't think it's worth weighting all that heavily. As a tiebreaker, if you come to the end of your draft process and you say, wow, I rate, let's say, Reed Sheppard and Donovan Clingan almost identical, then yeah, I would support then drafting Reed Sheppard because there's a bit more utility. He fits in a larger number of configurations. If it's a tiebreaker, sure. But if you come to the end of your process and say, wow, Donovan Clingan is the best guy on my board, then I don't think you say, no, I'm not taking him no matter what. And I'm going to take a player that I view as less just because it's easier for me to plot out exactly what his long-term fit is going to be.
No, fantastic points made there. And, elsewhere, when we look at kind of what we've witnessed so far from the draft combine, a few other things that we want to make sure we tackle here. Reed Sheppard has impressed so far through his movement shooting drills, knocking down shots. So the shooting is very much real.
Yeah, but the 42-inch vertical, that's pretty crazy, dude.
And it's funny because here's the thing is I see people clowning Reed Sheppard, say, oh, he's too small. He's not going to survive in the NBA. The Rockets were literally just lifted to a 41-41 season with a 6-foot-tall point guard in Fred Van. I'm taller than Fred VanVleet. Like, I stand next to the guy in scrums. Fred VanVleet is listed at 6 feet tall. I don't know if he's actually 6 feet tall, guys.
Yeah, I think he's 5'11".
So when I tell you that when you look at the skill set that Reed Sheppard has, I think there have been some draft analysts who have actually comped him to a Fred VanVleet type, right? Like Fred VanVleet light, right? The shot making, be able to shoot, off the dribble, off the catch, movement shooter, absolute lights out shooting, the defensive intensity, the vertical's kind of nice for a guy that was, reportedly athletically challenged. Obviously, athleticism has a lot more to do with just, your standing vertical, but I do think that people are kind of underrating the impact that Reed Sheppard's going to have one day in the NBA. And here's a side note. I would hate to see Reed Sheppard go to San Antonio. I would hate to see him go to San Antonio and
got him around Wemby,
do an all-star. Like that would be the exact kind of turn of fate is okay, the Rockets don't take Reed Sheppard and he falls to San Antonio either at 4 or 8 or whatever. And suddenly they turn him into an all-star if they don't, swoop in and go get Trae Young. But yeah, Reed Sheppard's been really good. And here's my sneaky pick and the guy that I'm slowly falling in love with more than any other prospect, Stephon Castle, who I think has a chance to
Madison's selling you.
Madison sold me real quick on Stephon Castle, and the more that I've watched him, the more that I've heard about him, and then obviously he crushed it in the three-point shooting drill at the combine, shot 18 of 25, 70%. Now, I know these drills are, they're not live game scenarios. They're different. It's just a shooting drill, but that's kind of the hang-up on him, right, is if the shot is real with him, everything else is off the charts. So that, he could potentially be both a safe pick, like a high floor player, and also a crazy upside pick if the shooting is really there.
Yeah, and in today's NBA, you can never have enough switchable wings, even though you have Ime Thompson and Tari, Eason, and Dillon Brooks. Number one, your roster may change, as we were just describing in the Donovan Clingan scenarios. You shouldn't act like the roster you have now is necessarily going to be what it looks like in 2 years. Some of these guys may not be here for one reason or another. Some of them may decline. You never know how development's going to happen. And even if, it turns out you have way too many switchable wings, then okay, that's a good problem to have. In worst case, you've got a good trade bait. You should evaluate Stephon Castle on his own merits. I agree with you. The other thing that I would say, as far as Reed Sheppard's size, keep in mind that the Rockets, this is not just about one draft prospect. This is about the entire core 6. The Rockets have pretty consistently drafted on certainly upside, but also I would say extreme length and athleticism. In the last 2 draft classes, Ime Thompson, Cam Whitmore.
Is a 42-inch vert extreme athleticism? I'm asking for a friend.
It is. I'm just saying because he's 6'3", because he's a little undersized and whatnot. The way people are going to look at this and say, well,
he's not a jumbo hooper.
Yeah, and you're putting him next to, as currently constructed, and again, that can change, but as currently constructed, your backcourt is Fred VanVleet, who's definitely undersized, and Jalen Green, who's probably a little bit undersized for his position. So I get the concern. But the last 2 years, last 4 first-round picks from those 2 years, so Ime Thompson, Cam Whitmore, Tari Eason, Jabari Smith Jr., those were all basically 4 long, uber-athletic, switchable wings. I consider Jabari for the most part a wing. I know he can slide to center, but the way the Rockets use him for the most part, and this is before Alperen Sengun got hurt, I think you would throw him in that wing tier, with Sengun primarily being your big. And so you have these wings, and then of course you've got Fred VanVleet as your primary ball handler, Aaron Holiday backing him up. So you've already got a ton of long, uber athletic wings that can, and quite frankly, they already are, offset the fact that your guards might be a little bit on the small side. And so while I've said throughout this podcast that you shouldn't draft based on the roster as is, I don't think that's true with any. You shouldn't do that in relation to any like one or two players. But when you look at the entire team, the Rockets do collectively have a lot of length, a lot of athleticism, to where I think you can survive being, a little undersized. I think he's dramatically undersized, just a little undersized, especially if he's an explosive athlete, which can overcome some of it. And especially if he can shoot at a high level, which pairs so well with what the Rockets want to do and fits so well around the pieces they have as currently constructed.
And just to add on to the point that you just made, kind of the inverse of the point that you're making is there's a very clear draft philosophy here with Rafael Stone, right? He has prioritized a very select group of players, length, athleticism, all that the past couple of years. So if anything, that there's some historical precedent for the type of player that he might be looking to pursue in this year's draft. So maybe Reed Sheppard actually doesn't fit that mold, despite some of the standout things that we've seen, the skills, all that. Maybe that doesn't jump off the paper as far as the internal evaluations that the Rockets are making.
It might not, although the 42-inch vertical definitely makes it jump a little bit more. But no, I think the Rockets are just very
Reggie
interesting.
Miller, get out of here with your puns.
I think the Rockets are just a very interesting team because, for the most part, the teams at the top of the lottery are desperate. There's a reason they're at the top of the lottery. And so I mentioned the Hawks and Wizards. I tend to think they'll go for higher upside swings because they don't have a lot as currently constructed that they really like. The Rockets do. So if they stay with pick 3, which is the hypothetical that we're going under at the moment, because that's the way things are right now on May 14th, then Houston has a little more flexibility than most teams do. I think the last few years, the Rockets were so down on their luck that you sort of had to just go for the biggest swings, hope for the best, because what else do you have? As opposed to now that you feel pretty good about the depth of talent and the team as a whole, then, maybe you can think a little more strategically about, not just when I say fit, I don't just mean fit relative to the roster that you have at this given moment. It can also be fit in regards to, the role of, say, an elite shooter on a contending team. I think that's something that disproportionately has more value as you get into bigger situations and the defenses become all the more difficult to unlock. I think that's something that when you get into a playoff format, we see all the time. A lot of guys who can't shoot get sort of played off the floor in these playoff settings. And so guys that have high-end upside as shooters become even more important. And so when we say fit, it's not just like saying, how they fit with the roster at present. It's also how they fit in regards to a contending team down the line. Most teams at the top of a lottery aren't considering that because they've just got to get off the ground floor. They've got to do whatever it takes to get them out of pure hell. If you're the Washington Wizards, for example, the Hawks aren't quite there, but I think the Hawks are sort of a weird situation in that we know there's some upheaval that's likely on the way related to Trae Young and DeJounte Murray. We've heard that for a while. The Rockets are a rare team that actually feels good about where they are now and should be even better in the near future based on the age of their current team, yet still has a high lottery pick. So I think, not saying for sure it'll lead to different criteria for Rafael Stone, but it potentially could lead to some different criteria relative to the last, at least the first couple of years of the rebuild, when I think they were just sort of like, look, we've just got to take the biggest upside swing that we can and hope for the best.
We want to know how you're feeling about the Houston Rockets number 3 overall pick. Which prospects are you most interested by? What stood out to you about our discussion in today's show? Let us know in the YouTube comments, but Ben, let everybody know where they can track you down at.
Yep. Ben DuBose on Twitter, the Rockets Wire and the Logger Line on the same, and rocketswire.usatoday.com for all your daily Houston Rockets news coverage.
That's going to do it for another edition of Locked On Rockets. As always, thank you so much for checking out the show. If you haven't done so yet, please consider subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Rockets. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, a 5-star review helps us out a ton. But as always, thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. And we look forward to having you back right here at Locked On Rockets, your daily podcast home for everything Houston Rockets basketball.